Welcome aboard the 1965 Porsche 911. It is among the earliest 911s built, especially for the US market. This car was built in April of 1965. I think the first US cars arrived in February. So a couple months into production. It has what is called a 300 serial number because the serial number starts 300. That's how you know it's a very early car. So it was built within the first few hundred 911s. All 911s have a particular charm to them. They were sort of derided for a long time for being a little bit scary and not as fast as some of the later cars. But now, of course, people have come around, as they often do with 911s. There's a long history of 911s that people said weren't very good, and then they came around at some point. And whether that means the mid-year cars from the mid-70s or the 964 was like that, the 996 is still a little bit like that. But there are always cycles among Porsche nuts about what is cool or what isn't cool. And for a long time, these early cars weren't that cool, but now they have become cool because they're the sort of first expression, the purest expression of the 911, which of course is such an iconic car that is one of the longest running sports cars, or really any car of all time. Of course, the Corvette has run longer since they started making those in 1953. But these cars sort of were unveiled in 1963. Production kind of began in 64 and was genuinely moving by 1965. So this car is an early car. It's kind of a neat example because it is well optioned and it comes in a cool color. It has these fabric seat inserts. It has a wood steering wheel. It has the fog lights, all the stuff that Porsche enthusiasts are excited by. And in addition to that, it was on the cover of the December of 1965 issue of Sports Car Illustrated, and confirmed by the fact that it has the same black plate with it that it wore on the cover of the magazine. So that's kind of a neat bonus as well.
When the 911 first came out, it was actually a bit controversial. We tend to think of it as being the default sports car choice now because it is so iconic, and it's become an unimaginative choice. But that wasn't the case when it first arrived. When Porsches were first created, they were strange sports cars that were rather expensive for what they were, especially because a lot of people thought of them as glorified Volkswagens. But they built a legendary following on the basis of this David beating Goliath ethos. Small displacement cars that could go toe-to-toe with big cars like Jaguars, Aston Martins, and Ferraris on the racetrack. And so Porsche cultivated this identity as the little guy who gets it done, and this was all built on the 356, the first Porsche model which had been around for 15 years by the time that the 901, as it was originally called, now 911, came out. The loss of the 356 caused a lot of hand-wringing among diehard Porsche enthusiasts. They were saying things like, oh, they're going to 6 cylinders instead of 4, and the body's changing for the first time ever. And of course, if this all sounds familiar, it's because a lot of the same hand-wringing occurred with the first liquid-cooled 911s, which appeared in the 1990s. The legendary Porsche formula of not changing just for the sake of change has been a persistent characteristic of the marque for 70 years.
So because the 911 was the first 6-cylinder car that Porsche built and sold to the public, it was somewhat controversial when it first came out, and it was a genuinely all-new car as well. And so people were a little bit apprehensive about it, especially the die-hard Porsche people. But of course they rapidly figured out that it was actually quite a good sports car and meaningfully better than the 356 in most ways. And as is often the case, if something is genuinely good and there's a bunch of loyal fans, then something new comes out and eventually they'll come around for the most part. And that is exactly what has happened with the 911. So these early cars have a lot of features that are unique to them, and of course they progressively disappeared over the years. And so people nowadays, I think because of impact bumper cars, tend to sort of lump all these early long hood cars together, but there's actually quite a substantial group of changes that occurred over the course of the years. Probably one of the biggest ones was they lengthened the wheelbase to make the handling a little bit less wayward for the 1969 model year. And lots of little detail changes. The placement of where the wipers park, they switched to the other side of the windshield. You know, you have the wood dashboard and the green gauges and the wood rim steering wheel, and all of those things disappeared pretty much after like 67, 68. And so the thing about this car as such an early car is that it basically has all of the little things that if you've spent a bunch of time in air-cooled 911s, but not necessarily early ones, there'll be a bunch of stuff in here where you're like, oh, that's different. I've never seen that before. And so that's part of the fun with these cars, is because they're so ubiquitous, and you know, enthusiasts who spend a lot of time around 911s, If you haven't spent a bunch of time with an early one, then you'll get in here and you'll be like, yes, I recognize everything. You know, the windows and the doors are the same and the gauges are all in the same place, and there's a lot of stuff that's familiar. But there's also a lot of little details where when you interact with it, you'll be like, oh, it's quite different. And the same thing applies when you drive it. Kind of like meeting, I don't know, a relative of someone you know really well, because you're like, oh, obviously they're related and they have some of the same turns of phrase, and there's definitely recognizable characteristics, but there's also very clearly indications that it's a different person that you're interacting with. And early 911s are like that. They developed a reputation for being a little bit scary to drive. I guess all 911s are a little bit like this, but yeah, it definitely needs two hands on the wheel. You have to be more awake. You are having more involvement and entertainment and engagement with the car at a lower speed, which is not a bad thing. That's kind of the old car experience. But the difference between this and sort of the ultimate long hood 911, ultimate meaning last, the Carrera RS is quite stark in terms of how they drive. I would say that those two cars have more gap between them than an SC and a Carrera RS does, honestly. So a lot of development happened in these early years, and these early cars are really appreciated because they feel really distinctly 1960s. You know, you get the chrome steel wheels, which are only 4.5 inches wide. It's just a really definitively 1960s feel in a way that, if you've not experienced these sort of early 911s, will be really unique and different for you as an enthusiast. The other thing about these early 911s that's really pretty neat is that the survival rate of these cars was pretty low. The thing about 911s is that the architecture remains the same for so long that anybody who wanted a cheaper car could buy an old one like this and make modifications to it to make it look like a newer car. And of course this happened all through the 70s, 80s, 90s and beyond. And so finding unmolested cars that have all of the early attributes unchanged and intact is really quite special. And as cars get restored, they usually get returned back to this early state, but just a lot of them were lost along the way. They didn't do any rust proofing and they're structurally vulnerable too. So finding a really early car that's survived like this is quite unusual. And generally speaking, I think that these early cars have a characteristic that I really like in old cars, which is a level of entertainment, a quotient of entertainment that is really high. You feel like you're doing a ton. The car asks a lot from you. The 901 gearbox is a dogleg 5-speed. They later went to 4 speeds as standard and made the 5-speed optional, and they had changed the shift pattern to a more conventional shift pattern for 1972 model year. And so there's a lot of technique and skill required to properly drive one of these cars, and I like cars that require that of the driver. If it's too easy, if it's too accessible, it's like someone who puts out on the first date. You miss the chase a little bit. And these cars are really good at delivering that. You know, it'll scare you a little bit if you overcook things and if you make bad judgment calls, but it will do exactly what you ask of it. And if that happens to be something dangerous, then you might soil yourself. And there's always something pleasurable about that. Not soiling yourself, but the excitement of needing to be involved in what the car is doing. And so that's really the charm of these early cars, is seeing the unadulterated, pure 1960s aesthetic and the driving experience that goes with it is really just an absolute pleasure for these early cars, and they are accordingly very collectible.